Today we're going to talk about the Keynesian revolution, the Neoclassical Synthesis, and Feminist Economics. So it's a big bite. Since the time of Karl Marx, depressions in capitalist economies were getting progressively worse. Despite this, the mainstream economists adhered to Say's law and argued involuntary unemployment was impossible, as were depressions, theoretically. The reality, they argued, was caused by workers refusing to work at the equilibrium wage rate. Basically, if workers would just accept lower wages, business confidence would return and investment would resume. Prosperity was just around the corner. In 1929, the stock market crash was an effect of the collapse of the economy. The stock market has no causal role in the economy for the most part. It's transfer payments. The banking system failed due to debt and credit deflation, and since banking was essentially unregulated and there was no central bank, confidence in the banking system disappeared. The world economy came to a halt. The policy responses around the world were ad hoc and irrelevant when not making things worse. For example, Herbert Hoover was cutting government spending to build business confidence. John Maynard Keynes, already an important economic theorist because of his book A Treatise on Money, addressed the inability of economics or policymakers to address the increasing instability in capitalist economies. He did this in his book, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, in 1936. In the book, which is aimed at mainstream professional economists, he argued that mainstream neoclassical theory was relevant to a special case that only rarely occurred in reality. Now, the key feature of his analysis was aggregate expenditures, what he called effective demand and what we now call aggregate demand. This is where the identity that total national expenditure equals consumption plus investment plus government plus net exports comes from, which is equivalent to national income, which is the sum of wages, profits, rents, and interest. Okay, so rather than looking at individual actors, he's looking at these aggregate expenditures or aggregate income flows in the economy to get a sense of how the entire economy is working. His book made other key contributions. He argued that the economy exists and must be understood in real historical time. Okay, microeconomics is logical time. In our diagrams on the horizontal axis, we put quantity at a point in time. And then we do an analysis that looks at the movement between two time periods. But if you don't put the arrows on the graph, you can interpret exactly the same graph going where the change is going in an opposite direction. In other words, the logical analysis can run frontwards, backwards, and it's completely the same. If you go from time A to time B, and then you reverse the change that caused time B, then you go back to time A. It's a perfectly symmetric in logical time analysis, and he wants us to move away from that to realize that economies function in real time and that people experience time going in one direction forward. This is really important because it's about the future. You see, for him, investment is determined by investors' expectations. All right? Firms, people invest because they hope to make a profit. And if they expect to make a profit because things out there look pretty good, then they'll invest. Okay? The trouble is, these expectations are formed in an environment of uncertainty. Now, uncertainty is different than risk. Risk has a probabilistic determination, so you can do projections based on risk analysis. But uncertainty is radical uncertainty. It means stuff happens that's completely unpredictable for reasons we don't know. The world we live in is radically uncertain. Okay, that's why in an economic downturn, businesses do not form expectations for profit because the future going forward is totally uncertain. There's no way of knowing what's going to happen. So he argues that investors essentially invest because of animal spirits, right? Not rational calculations, because rational calculation is impossible. Now, another thing you need to realize is that Keynes' analysis is a disequilibrium analysis. He uses the terminology of equilibrium because he's writing for mainstream economists of his time. But what he's looking at is an economy going forward through time, which is changing. And only rarely does it get to an equilibrium. And when it does, he notes, it is not necessarily or even reliably or even occasionally a full employment equilibrium. Also, money is not neutral in this framework. In classical economics, money is just a means of exchange. And in neoclassical economics, it's just a means of exchange. The amount of money doesn't have any impact on the economy. And Keynes rejects this. He rejected it in the Treatise on Money, and in the general theory, he's explicitly talking about the fact that money is endogenous. And that means it is not determined by the amount of gold you have. It is not determined by the amount of notes printed by the government and passed around. It is determined by the operating of the economic system. All right? And the mechanism of this can be many different things, but it's not we dump more money in. Money gets created all the time in the normal workings of capitalism. It is not necessarily created by a central banking authority. And when Keynes is writing this, there is the Bank of England, but the United States doesn't have a functioning central bank yet. Okay, so the key takeaways are aggregate analysis, uncertainty, historic time, expectations, disequilibrium, and endogenous money. But the key, the absolute key, is to get out of a depression, you have to increase aggregate demand. You have to increase expenditures somehow. Mainstream economists, many mainstream economists, had a very difficult time seeing the implications of Keynes' analysis or really even understanding it, so they changed it into a way they could understand it. One, Sir John Hicks, in a famous article called Mr. Keynes in the Classics, a Suggested Interpretation, which was in the journal Economica in 1937 and still being read when I was in graduate school. Hicks created the familiar equilibrium representation of Keynes' argument, known as ISLM analysis, which you all learned in intermediate macro, right? So this is very familiar. Hicks came with that. Interestingly, in 1980, first of all, he dropped his title, Sir. He didn't publish under that again, so it was just John Hicks. And he wrote an article called ISLM, an Explanation, in which he recanted ISLM as a mischaracterization of Keynes's argument based on a fundamental misunderstanding of his, that it in fact is looking at disequilibrium. In the United States, Alvin Hansen of Harvard University also published a book on Keynes economics called A Guide to Keynes, which was a popular textbook to teach Keynes to students, but also did it from an equilibrium perspective that was much more palatable to mainstream economists. So this equilibrium interpretation of Keynes that we see in ISLM became the dominant way that mainstream economists presented it to their students. Now, Hansen's book comes out in 1953, but he was teaching at Harvard, and one of his students, or a student who was frequently around and became a professor at Harvard, was, of course, the famous Paul Samuelson. And he writes almost the original modern textbook of economics. It was called Economics, an Introductory Analysis in 1948. And he combined marginalist neoclassical price theory, what we call microeconomics, with an equilibrium interpretation of Keynes' income analysis, what we call macroeconomics. And he created what's come to be called the Neoclassical Synthesis. This is what is taught in almost all principles of economics classes in the world, with a small smattering of monetary theory propounded by mainstream economists who rejected Keynes' work in its entirety. All right, there were very conservative economists, opponents of Keynes' general theory, and they became what was called monetarists. They rejected Keynes' notion of using increased aggregate demand to get out of depressions, and argued that all economies should be governed by monetary policy, and in fact made the famous argument by Milton Friedman that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, which of course is shown to be absurd by the supply side inflation we currently have due to interruptions in the supply chain. All right, had nothing to do with the money supply. Now, Keynes, who died young, and his colleagues at the time he was writing the general theory and afterwards when they were discussing it, and his students rejected this neoclassical synthesis interpretation of Keynes. Joan Robinson, possibly the most famous woman economist in the 20th century, called it bastard Keynesianism. These scholars continued to develop Keynes thought and develop post-Keynesian economics, an alternative school of thought. Many such economists treat original institutional economics, which we talked about last time, as the micro-foundation of their analysis, and post-Keynesian economics as the macro-analysis, as a combined school of thought. There have been a number of other innovations since the neoclassical synthesis in mainstream economics, most prominently game theory by John von Neumann and Oscar Morgenstern, introduced in A Theory of Games and Economic Behavior in the 1930s. By 1980, it had generally replaced general equilibrium theory as the leading direction of research in microeconomics. Okay, general equilibrium analysis was so general and the assumptions were so specific, you really couldn't do anything with it. With game theory, you could look at strategic behavior, and the games that you constructed were exemplars of how firms and agents, like consumers, might act in an environment where they had limited choice, rationality, and a few other things. Some mainstream economists have begun to focus on institutions to some degree in what they call the new institutional economics. Behavioral economics has made some inroads in thinking differently about rationality in human behavior. But with all these innovations within mainstream economics, they tend to hold on to rationality and equilibrium, and the goal and emphasis is always on efficiency. So they hold on to that fundamental microeconomic framework throughout their analysis. There are people who try and do more interesting things with it, but basically that's where the mainstream is today. Next, I want to talk about feminist economics, which I have down here. This is a new movement in economics. Now, John Stuart Mill in the mid-19th century, as mentioned in an earlier video, Thorstein Veblen, and Charlotte Perkins Gilman in the late 19th and early 20th century, and Veblen and Gilman were close personal friends, all wrote on the role of women in the economy. But this was not a main theme among economists during this period of time. They still looked at rational economic man as representative of all human behavior. Obviously, the women's suffrage movement in the early 20th century in the US and UK had tremendous implications for women's rights in every area of life, including the economy. In the 1960s, the women's liberation movement revitalized these concerns. As a result, significant changes took place. In the academy, women's studies programs were started, and HWS was a pioneer in this type of education. Okay, we had one of the first women's studies departments in the country. Ever conservative economists largely ignored all this until the late 1980s. At that time, women economists and allies organized to bring the role of women in the economy in from the margins and move beyond economic man. And by the way, those two phrases are the titles of two very important books in feminist economics. They formed an organization called the International Association for Feminist Economics and started a journal called Feminist Economics. Many HWS economists and HWS non-economists played important roles in this movement and still do today. They include Joyce Jacobson, William Waller, Linda Robertson from our Media and Society program, Randy Albelda, Ann Jennings, Teresa Amat, who's on our board now and is a former provost, Elizabeth Ramey, and Gul Unal in more recent years. And it's become a regular part of our program, starting with Randy Albelda, teaching women in the economy, followed by Ann Jennings, building a course on economics and gender, which is still taught today by Professor Wilson. Feminist economics is different from all other schools of thought in economics. It includes economists from every approach to economics, sharing and learning from one another in a civil way, even though they approach economics from all of the perspectives currently at play in the world of economic research, analysis, and policy formation. In order for such a discussion, indeed any civil discussion, to take place, all the participants must agree on at least one premise. In other words, to have a conversation with a person, you have to agree on at least one thing. And in feminist economics, such a fundamental agreement exists. That agreement is gender and the role of women is important in all aspects of social behavior, especially the economy. And economics is the study of the social provisioning of society in such a way that members of that society have a decent life and the opportunity to explore their capacities in a meaningful way. Feminist economics is at its core an economics of care.